All right, Matthew chapter 10, beginning at verse 1, says this. He called his 12 disciples to him, and he gave them authority to drive out spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who's called Peter, and his brother Andrew. James, son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew. Thomas and Matthew the tax collector. James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus. Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. A couple things I want to point out from this. One is, those of you who were here last week, remember that the last thing Jesus did was say to his disciples, pray that the Lord would send workers out into the harvest field, for the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. And what do you know, right after he does that, he says, okay, you guys are the ones who are going out into the harvest field. And in the first two verses, he creates a change of identity. I don't know if you noticed this as you read verse 1 and verse 2, but in verse 1 it says Jesus called his 12 disciples. And then in verse 2, it says, these are the names of the 12 apostles. And this is the first time that the disciples are called apostles. What's the transition there? Because I think this is a big deal, what's happening in Matthew chapter 10. Well, a disciple is a learning follower. It's somebody who said, I have hitched my wagon onto Jesus, and I'm going to observe everything that he has to say, and I'm going to do what he does, and I'm going to follow him. An apostle is a sent one. It's someone who's been with Jesus and has gone out to be his ambassador or his messenger. And Jesus is sending out his disciples for the very first time in Matthew chapter 10, and he's saying, I'm wanting you to make a transition from being a disciple to an apostle. And they've got that new identity at that time. Now, this is interesting because I think this helps us to understand a little bit about how our spiritual journeys work. Most people start off their spiritual journey as some kind of an investigator. Checking out things about faith in God, checking it against the facts, seeing if it's really true, seeing what it's like. If I do become a follower of Jesus, what is that life going to be like? There's an investigation stage that most people go through. And incidentally, we hope that Christ Community Church is the kind of church that's great for investigators, for people who are checking things out. We hope this is a safe place for you to hear a dangerous message, ask hard questions, and evaluate the direction of life. But at some point, an investigator has to make a decision. An investigator has to decide, am I actually going to trust Jesus or am I not going to trust Jesus? Am I going to become a disciple? And at that point, you say, I'm following Jesus, I'm hanging out with him, I'm doing what he tells me to do, and that's a very good thing. But there's yet another transition that happens, and this happens in Matthew 10, where you become not just someone who's following Jesus, a comfortable absorber of information, someone whose personal life is being changed, but you become an agent of God to be changing the world. You are a sent one. And there's some people here today who have been in this comfortable category for an awful long time, and it's about time for you to make the transition to being a sent one, just like they made in Matthew chapter 10. So Jesus picks 12. He's got 12 disciples that he picks out of the crowd, and Jesus picks 12 not just because he likes a number that's easily divisible by multiple numbers. He picks 12 not because he's about to head out to Dunkin' Donuts and he wants everything to be split evenly. He picks 12 because he's making a statement. He's making a statement about a new covenant because, you see, in the nation of Israel, everybody knows there's 12 tribes of Israel. And that about 1,500 years earlier, 2,000 years earlier, there was a guy by the name of Jacob, and Jacob was renamed Israel, and this Israel had 12 sons, and those 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, in choosing 12 disciples, Jesus is kind of taking on the role of Jacob. We had an old Jacob in the Old Testament. We got a new Jacob now in the New Testament, and I am him. Now, as you read the Bible, as you've been reading through the book of Matthew, and I hope all of you are partway through your third reading of the book of Matthew, you got 2 weeks left to finish that third reading, I hope one of the things that you notice is that there are some prophecies that Jesus never had the power to fulfill, but they got fulfilled anyway, like where he would be born or when he would die or how he would die. Jesus had no control over that, and yet it fulfilled the prophecies. But there are other pictures of the Old Testament that Jesus is fulfilling intentionally. He's sending a message by fulfilling these different prophecies. So one of them is this choosing of the 12. We have a 12-part division, just like the Old Covenant. When Jesus raises a little girl from the dead, well, that's just like Elijah from the Old Testament. When he stands on the mountain giving a famous sermon, he's just like Moses from the Old Testament. When he answers critics about his actions on the Sabbath, he's David. When he's 3 days below the earth, he's Jonah. When people come from all over the world to ask for his wisdom, he's Solomon. And more than just flashbacks, what Jesus is doing is he's saying there's been a story that's been written throughout history in the nation of Israel, and that story is reaching its climax right now in my story. This is not only the story of Israel and my story, it's the story of the world. It's the story for everyone. And can you see how it's all being tied together? There's thousands of years of history in one single life. And even in picking the 12 disciples, Jesus is making that kind of statement. Now, more than flashbacks, the disciples are people who you would not expect. Disciples are people who you would not expect. 4 of them are fishermen from the podunk town of Capernaum. He's got in his group a tax collector who was a colleague of the Romans in order to get money from the Jews, and he's also got a zealot, Simon the Zealot, who was wanting to kill the Romans. And I wonder what happened when he sat across from Matthew, the tax collector, who was in league with the Romans. And then you got a couple of guys like James and John. You know, they were known as the sons of thunder. And we don't know if it was because, they were really loud or because their dad was really loud or because they announced the drag races on Sunday. But whatever it was, they were loud. On the other hand, you got Bartholomew. And we don't even know one thing that Bartholomew said. He was a really quiet guy. Jesus picks this odd, ragtag bunch of people, not the Harvard scholars, not the curve wreckers. And that should be encouraging to you because it's really encouraging to me that God can pick people who are quite ordinary and use them to change the world. That's what God's in the business of. He's choosing people just like you, and he's calling you out to be a disciple and then to be an apostle because he can use you to change the world.